On today's World Insight, tensions on the high seas, what a U.S. Navy dual carrier drill in the South China Sea means for relations and stability. And recent spikes in U.S. coronavirus infections, as many as 50,000 a day, worry public health experts. A word with the editor of the New England Journal of Medicine.
We have an interest in making sure that infectious diseases which don't respect borders are controlled everywhere.
Here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei in Beijing. Let's begin the program with worsening tensions between China and the United States. Two U.S. aircraft carriers, the USS Ronald Reagan and USS Nimitz, are in the waters of the South China Sea. It's the first time Washington sent two carriers for drills in the area since 2014. This when the Chinese Navy had just begun military drills in the area days before. China's foreign ministry said the U.S. had deliberately sent the ships to the South China Sea to flex its muscles and accused Washington of trying to drive a wedge between China and countries in the region. So, what does the presence of the two carriers from the U.S. mean for regional stability? How big is the potential damage to already frosty China-U.S. relations? Let's loop in our guest on this. On the South China Sea issue, we are joined via Zoom in Shanghai, Shending Li, professor from the Institute of International Studies, Fudan University in D.C., Michael O'Halloran, who is a senior fellow with the Center for 21st Century Security and Intelligence and director of the Research for Foreign Policy at the Brookings Institution. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. How shall we assess the danger that is going on right now in South China Sea in terms of the face-off, quote-unquote, as some say, between China and the United States? Mr. O'Halloran.
I think it's always concerning when you have the world's two greatest superpowers in close proximity with their military forces, and they each have somewhat competing views about the future proper role of the South China Sea and of who should be there with which assets. On the other hand, I don't really expect any kind of conflict because I think that both sides realize in the end they can't lightly take aim at each other's military forces. And the United States in this particular situation mostly wants to reaffirm international right of passage. So I don't think that China is really going to try to prevent the carriers from operating in the South China Sea. I don't think the United States is going to try to prevent China from building up or sustaining military assets on the various islands in the South China Sea. Each side sort of has to accept some things the other side is doing that it might not prefer.
Okay.
But I think in the end, that's what will happen.
Professor Shen, I really want to have your opinions as well about that.
Well, I think the two countries share lots of common interests. They want to maintain the region peaceful and stable, and they don't want to use force to resolve any conflict. But both Navy are staging their drill in this place and presenting their will and muscle, making people a bit concerned if they want to use military to reinforce their claim for China's claim that it has legitimate sovereign and historical rights, and the U.S. claim to keep the region free of threat by exercising its right of freedom of navigation. That's a bit upsetting.
China seems to have the impression, Professor Shen, that by claiming or putting a tag of China being quote-unquote assertive, the U.S. could explore the space of putting a tag to China like that and therefore increase its presence in the South China Sea. The two aircraft carrier is a great reflection, quote-unquote, of that. Is that true, Professor Shen?
Well, as Michael has said, the U.S. presence in the region is a response to China's growing military presence in accordance to China's claim in the area encircled by non-dash line. But in China's view, China may have a different opinion. The U.S. Navy sailed into the territorial water of Plateau, Jisha Pingdao. And so the UNCLOS would allow the U.S. to do this under the name of innocent passage. But the frequent sailing in such a close area to China territory, this island, which is not disputed between China and the U.S., but sending military to such a close area, in China's view, is not a response to China's military presence. But in China's view, is a show that the U.S. has an interest and should maintain not only peace and stability, but also its dominion in the region. That U.S. may not agree, but China may have perceived this way. This kind of Chinese perception and the U.S. may refuse to be perceived this way, exactly generate the kind of contradiction and may lead the two military to some unpleasant event, even though we don't want them to conflict.
Okay, Mr. O'Hanlon, how confident is the U.S. side that it will not play with the fire in a way, quote unquote, and there will not be any conflict or any accident? How certain is the United States could be about that?
Well, I think there are two answers to that question, which are somewhat contradictory. On the one hand, we've all seen this news that two aircraft carriers are headed for the South China Sea, and most people are not talking about it very much. You know, we seem pretty calm because we're used to this sort of issue. Now, we don't always send two aircraft carriers, but we have frequently asserted the right of innocent passage, as Professor Deng-Xing Li just said. So in that sense, it feels sort of normal. And in the United States this week, people are talking more about the explosion of our COVID cases and the presidential election than they are about sending two aircraft carriers to the South China Sea.
Because your media have been reporting very little about that, because you have a bigger crisis that you have to fight, another fire. But it doesn't mean this fire is becoming smaller. It does not justify that, I'm afraid.
No, I agree. That's what I'm trying to get at. So on the one hand, you asked me how we're interpreting this. On the one hand, people seem pretty calm.
I'm asking you, how could the United States be able to guarantee there will not be any playing of fire?
Well, I think that's a different question. And what I was about to say is that most of us who follow U.S.-China strategic relations are nervous. I think we're nervous on both sides of the Pacific. My guess is that Professor Deng-Xing Li is a little nervous. I'm a little nervous. When we see the world's two most powerful countries trying to figure out a new way to coexist in the Western Pacific, as China's power has given it many more capabilities than it ever had before in this region, we are all a little bit nervous. So even though this is not the top headline in the newspaper, I think we have to worry, as you say, that we cannot guarantee that this will be safe. And so I would prefer that the two sides try to figure out some kind of a compromise. I think China needs to accept the United States is going to keep moving its Navy in the South China Sea, but the United States needs to accept that China will pursue some of its ambitions in that region in economic and territorial terms in regard to islands, in regard to economic development. Neither side is going to like that compromise perfectly, but that would be safer than having our military forces operate in this sort of a tense way in close proximity to each other.
Professor Shen, it was from the year 2009 that the U.S. has been consistently increasing its presence militarily in the South China Sea, according to some of the media, international media reports. For example, the number of ships in the region, the number of sorties increasing to a much bigger number than it used to be. And now we have seen, since the COVID-19 outbreak, the U.S. side did not decrease, but rather doing the other way around. Well, China is also trying to fight an outbreak like that. So how shall we understand the ever-increasing presence of U.S. military in the South China Sea? Will China do the same? How will China guarantee about not having any accident?
As our conversation between Michael and myself have been developed in such a way, the U.S. presence in this region in South China Sea is, in Michael's view, is a response to China's growing military activity in the region. Therefore, U.S. want to do something to make sure the region is still peaceful and stable. But despite the U.S. best intention, China has perceived this not exactly as the U.S. has presented. Primarily, when the U.S. naval ship sailed into the territorial water of Spratly, these are within 12 nautical miles. Theoretically, the UNCLOS would allow the U.S. to do this because the U.S. can claim its right of innocent passage. But China has its own national law. That may make China to think its national law may supersede with the international law. National law of the maritime territorial water law states, without China's prior permit, other countries' ship shall not sail into. U.S. use international law. China has not enforced its national law by kicking out the U.S. Ship. But China is nervous. As Michael has stated, both countries should reduce their apprehension with each other or against each other by making some dialogue and making some concession with each side. China should present itself in a way in the region not to disrupt the international sea lane of communication, so freedom of navigation of whatever civilian or military is guaranteed. Mm-hmm. But in the meantime, the U.S. should accord more consciousness. This is China's territorial water. U.S. can do this kind of sailing probably outside, a bit distant from China's island.
What we are talking about today is not what we talked about in 2009. There's a huge difference in terms of the strategic relations between China and the United States. And this is an election year. This is also a year that has been haunted by this global pandemic, which make every economy, every government, every country suffers and feel nervous about. So what does that mean, this South China Sea issue, reflected by increasing military presence from both sides? Are they trying to play with fire at this critical point? Are they trying to answer their domestic nationalism in some corners of the societies? Do we have people that really have cool mind?
Generally, Chinese government and the media and the public may perceive the U.S. increasing presence in the region so close to China's territory as at least unfriendly or maybe hostile. Coupled with the recent U.S. Air Force, it's a transporter flying over the space of Taiwan. In China's view, Taiwan is a part of China, and Taiwan space is China's territorial space. When China and the U.S. made the official relationship in 1979, U.S. agreed to withdraw its military from Taiwan. Now the U.S. military, the Air Force, is flying over Taiwan. And the U.S. Marine has released its video having court drill training program wearing U.S. uniform. And they are operating in Taiwan with Taiwan's military force. All this violated China-U.S. agreement. All U.S. troops should withdraw from Taiwan. That forms the foundation for China-U.S. official relationship, the so-called normalization. China would perceive all this as a kind of provocation. This is my observation.
Mr. O'Hanlon.
I don't know any Americans who want to have a showdown with China in naval terms in the South China Sea. No one wants that. There's no domestic pressure for that. So to the extent that's happening, to some extent with these aircraft carriers, I think it's more a reflection of the national military strategy and the national defense strategy of Secretary Mattis. And he said that we should be strategically predictable, but operationally unpredictable. Mattis, when he was Secretary of Defense in 2017 and 2018, he proposed this somewhat more flexible and creative and unpredictable way of operating U.S. military forces. And I think that's the logic that you're seeing right now, because Secretary of Defense Esper has said that his job is really to implement the strategy that Jim Mattis created.
However, unpredictability does not mean ruining the earlier agreement. Unpredictability does not also mean that there will not be any logic that should be followed in terms of respecting each other's bottom lines. So, Mr. O'Hanlon, while trying to understand the ego of every U.S. general and every administration official currently in Washington, people are having a hard time trying to understand why the U.S. will not go with the earlier agreement with China about Taiwan, as Professor Shen earlier mentioned, and some of the other things regarding security. This is not just about trade. This is about security.
Well, I agree that the Taiwan issue is especially delicate. And on this issue, I think China has been consistent for many decades. We all know China's view, and we know that China views Taiwan as an integral part of its own sovereign territory, and that it hopes someday for reunification, and that it may not be patient forever. All those things we understand, and those things have been consistent from China for many, many decades. So I think that I personally am in favor of handling the Taiwan issue with the utmost of care and trying not to disrupt past patterns.
The increasing presence of military in the South China Sea are making these economies also more nervous about a reluctant choice they had to make in the near future, and they don't want to do that. So, Mr. O'Hanlon, while thinking about the security, does the U.S. also thinking about its commitment to create peace in the region, even for its allies?
Yes, the great challenge of our time, in my opinion, is to figure out how China will play a much greater role than before, given its new power, economic power, strategic and diplomatic power, military power, in a way that's still in the mutual interest of everyone in the region. And so in this regard, the United States and China are sort of natural balancers against each other. It's not like the Cold War. I don't think it's containment. I don't think it has to be hostile. But in some sense, we are trying to figure out how China can be more powerful and influential, but in a way that also respects the traditional rights of other countries. And the United States has to find a way to, again, balance China's presence, but try to also acknowledge that China is going to rise and be more powerful than it has been before. And that's going to sometimes require uncomfortable choices for us. The key is to protect the most important things: territorial sovereignty, sea lanes, economic choices, diplomatic choices for all countries in the region.
Mr. O'Hanlon, of course, you are the very sensible voice coming from Washington. We respect that. Professor Shen, your thoughts?
I think China and U.S. can work together to reduce such a challenge for them to choose. U.S. purpose is to make the region predictably peaceful and stable. So U.S. may have some worry. China is wise. China reclaim the land, and China may militarize the island. So U.S. want to make sure China will not do more. And China want to talk to each of them individually through many parallel bilateral talk to be coupled with multilateral talk. China is willing to talk. So probably U.S. can encourage us, China, Vietnam bilateral, China, ASEAN multilateral, to talk this important security and economic issue. Therefore, each side can make some compromise and would gain some access through collaboration. While our two sides still need to talk to reduce any unintended negative consequence due to such a kind of operational unpredictability. So I would urge our two military should meet and talk.
Shending Li, Michael O'Halloran, thank you so much, gentlemen. It's wonderful to hear logical and also intellectual discussion and debate between the two of you. I want to thank you for that.